Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Always happy to tell a bit more about what we're doing and why we're doing it. Wanted to give you just a quick overview of who I am without spending too much time on that. I was born and raised in Germany. I lived in 14 different countries and worked for about 17 years in the financial industry. On the technology side, I've been writing trading and risk management systems, and I can tell you, don't ever do that. It's boring. And worst of all, there's no meaning in it. I look back at a long career in banking, which was paid very well, but I really didn't do anything that had meaning. And that is why I started Poseidon, because I felt it was time for me to do something that really has an impact and can make the world a better place. So before I tell you what we're doing at Poseidon, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of why we're doing it. I will walk you through a little bit about the topics of climate change, about carbon credits, which is an interesting way to direct funding to sustainable development projects. I will talk a little bit about blockchain technology and why I prefer it to not be called blockchain technology, and then why we're using it for Poseidon. So everybody knows about climate change. You all heard about it, or you have all experienced it. I was very intimately touched by climate change when I lived in Singapore. There's a phenomenon in Singapore called the haze. They even have an extra website just for that. Every summer for 1-2 weeks, something like that, there's unfortunately in neighboring countries some quite aggressive deforestation happening, and they're burning down forests at an incredible scale, and it happens every year, and it's illegal. The governments try to shut it down and they're helpless, and the smoke blows over to Singapore, and it's so bad that you stand on a street and you can't see the other side of the street. It's actually so bad that on several days during this haze, the government announces that it's too unhealthy outside to leave the home, and the citizens are advised to stay at home because of the bad air quality. That really shocked me, because Singapore is, I think, still the country with the highest number of millionaires per capita. I think it's still the richest country, if not one of the richest countries in the world, and even they are unable to protect their citizens from devastating effects of climate change. That woke me up, and I looked at climate change and at the environment more closely since then. And I always thought I would like to do something where we can help the environment be a better place, be a place where we as a species live in harmony without destroying it, which, to be honest, we've been doing quite successfully for a very long time. There are many different ways how governments, corporates, and people try to address climate change. Climate action is a big thing. Everybody's like, yay, we do something, we're going to help the planet. But how does it really work? So some of the approaches are, okay, we have greenhouse gas emissions, let's reduce them. So companies look at changing their technologies and maybe having less greenhouse gas emissions. There are initiatives by transportation companies to switch over to electric transportation, and so on and so on. So there's all these different initiatives, and many people try to do something, which is great, and all of those initiatives are important, but unfortunately, very few of them can address the problem fast enough. And I heard a really nice analogy the other day. So if you come into your kitchen and you see the floor is covered in water because somebody left the tap open, what would you do first? Would you try to get a big bucket and just spend the next few days cleaning up as much water as you can? Well, you could, and that's exactly what we're doing at the moment globally, as far as I'm aware. But what we should be doing is we should be going to the tap and close the tap. And that's not what we're doing at the moment. So we're trying to address effects of climate change. We're trying to address our creation of greenhouse gas emissions. But what we're not really addressing at the moment is to protect the environment, to give the world a fighting chance against climate change. What I mean by that is, and that's what shocks me the most about what we're doing as a species, is deforestation at a global scale. I mean, the amount of forestry we're cutting down daily globally, and we continue to cut down, is really sickening. So what we were looking at when we're looking at climate action was we need to really stop deforestation. We need to find a way to protect ecosystems so that the planet can do two things. First, keep carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that were absorbed out of the atmosphere in the current carbon sinks, and have the ability to absorb more greenhouse gas emissions. Because this is what happens. You're somewhere in the Amazon and you witness deforestation. What they're doing is they're cutting down hectares of trees and they burn them. That's like the silliest thing we can do, because not only do you remove the trees that can absorb greenhouse gases, but you're releasing all the greenhouse gases that were absorbed for the last decades or centuries back into the atmosphere. It's really totally shocking. So one way to address this is by running projects that conserve forestry. We're working with several projects together through our strategic partner Ecosphere Plus, and we're having, for example, a project in Cordillera Azul, which is in Peru, where we with Poseidon have so far protected around 55 million trees, supported 500 people in local communities, and protected an area that's double the size of Andorra. And if you don't know what Andorra is, then it's 24% larger than New York City, so it's quite a sizable amount, which is great. But how do you do that? Do you just go there and you buy the land and you hope nobody's going to touch it? That obviously wouldn't work, right? The minute you look away, they come again and cut it down. So you need to work with local communities. So the way to do it is to channel funding to local communities and to help them create a life they feel is worth living, create a sustainable way to provide funding for the lifestyle they want to lead. And we do that by providing them through sustainable development projects, means to grow, for example, cocoa, and then use this cocoa in processing plants that we set up to create chocolate, which in fair trade is then sold around the world in chocolate bars or powders or in other ways. And that gives them now a way to live a life where they don't have to accept money from illegal mining companies or from people who try to grow palm oil plantations. So we have climate change, we have a way to address it. Now, how do we get the funding there? So a way to get funding there is by creating a commodity around protecting the forestry. And this commodity is, and it has been around for a while, is carbon credits. Carbon credits have been around for several years, and with the first Kyoto Agreement, governments around the world looked at how can we address climate change. And probably more familiar is the Paris Agreement. Since the Paris Accord, there are clear ambitions to cut down greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, and one of the tools are carbon credits. The problem with carbon credits, and that is a phenomenon we see globally, is twofold. First, there are many, many different types of carbon credits. So you have some companies that say, okay, we used coal-powered plants, now we're using solar, so now we have a delta, and that's a carbon credit, which we think is a little bit on the edge. And then you have carbon credits that protect forestry, which we think, as I explained, is the best way to address climate change. The way these carbon credits work is that when you conserve a forest, you are basically saying, okay, this forest has the capability of absorb this much carbon out of the atmosphere every year. Then you get external auditors like Ernst & Young, KPMG or so, to come in to independently verify that the methodology is sound and that this forest can really absorb that much greenhouse gas emissions. And it's a pretty long process with many different parties working together, but in the end you have this commodity, which is a carbon credit, and you can sell this carbon credit to companies that have a carbon footprint. And there are some countries that demand that. There are other countries where companies are doing it on a voluntary basis, but the gist of it is you have parties that do something that create greenhouse gas emissions, and they then purchase carbon credits to offset the negative impact they're having, to balance out what they're doing to the environment. In theory, that's great. There are a couple of issues with that. One of the big problems you have in the carbon markets is that the processes are very manual, and they're quite dysfunct. You have many different parties working on data, and if you know one thing about data is if you have 2 or 3 people all holding copy of data, you're not really sure whether it's the same data. So there are challenges around that. You have different parties that try to work on a project together. And another issue is because the monitoring of it is very difficult, and I don't mean the monitoring of the forests, but the monitoring of these carbon credits, that there's something very bad going on called double counting, where people sell a carbon credit to one party, turn to another party and sell the carbon credit to that party. Obviously, none of that extra money ever ends up in the forest protection projects. So unfortunately, it's something we see a lot in humanity, right? Greed and ways where capitalists try to find angles to make more money than they should. So that's a bit challenging, and that has stopped carbon markets from maturing and scaling the way they should. Because really, we're in a situation at the moment that the carbon market should be the largest market in the world. There shouldn't be another market on the stock exchange or in any other exchange that has a bigger volume than the climate related markets, but they're not. And the reason is because traders are very worried about engaging in carbon credits, since there is so much uncertainty about the data. If you have a trader from any trading desk today, he's trading products where he knows exactly what he's trading. He receives a term sheet, he knows, okay, this is the product, this is the value, I'm pricing it, I'm selling it. When a trader looks at a carbon credit, they typically question every bit of information they got, just because there's so much uncertainty in the market. And that makes it just so difficult that people shy away from it and they're not really interested. Another issue in carbon markets is that you have a smallest volume, which is a ton of carbon, and the reason that is the smallest volume is because of all the overhead you need to process it. It doesn't make sense for them to make smaller units. So there are several issues associated with carbon markets. Obviously, we want to solve these issues so that we can direct funding to these forest conservation projects I mentioned, so that we can do effective climate change to address, effective climate action to address the climate change that is becoming a really big problem for us. So when I started Poseidon, we looked at the challenges we have, and we did an assessment of how we could apply technology to address these challenges, and it turned out that blockchain was a very good way of doing it. Now, before I go too much into how we're using blockchain to do it, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about blockchain. Earlier this year, I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos and spoke about Poseidon, and the flavor of the moment is blockchain. Everywhere you go, everybody talks about blockchain. It's so bad, somebody's arm hurts, and they said, let's put your arm on the blockchain, it's going to be fine. And it's really ridiculous, especially because once you dissect the business plans and the ambitions of blockchain companies, a lot of them are just money-making machines. People feel, hey, blockchain sounds great, people throw money at blockchain, let's do something with blockchain. And companies start looking at blockchain as the asset and then try to find something they can wrap around it to make it sound great, which is obviously not the right way of doing it. And the reason that's happening is because a lot of money has been made with blockchain. Bitcoin has been mentioned very often in the media, and obviously people put in, we all heard about these young kids who put in a few $100s and now worth millions of dollars, which is good for them, it's great. But that has kind of tarnished the whole name or really clouded what blockchain is about. So let me bring it back to basics. Blockchain is a database. Blockchain is nothing other than a way to store, manage, and communicate data. That's all blockchain is. You then have in the distributed ledger and in the blockchain you have this several other technologies that are used. that come together, like the reason it's called a blockchain is because you have blocks at certain intervals. But you could very simply look at it the following way. You have a few kids playing in a room with toys, and you come in and you take a photograph. And then you leave that photograph. And every 5 minutes you come and you take a photograph. And then you can tell a story later at which point in time, how many toys were in that room, who played with which toy, and where each toy was. And you have a record in your ledger that shows you exactly what was going on. And because these are photographs that you didn't store digitally, you actually printed them out. Let's say you printed them out in a way that the photographs don't get damaged, but you basically have a proof that's immutable, because if you then have a photograph that was taken yesterday at a certain time, you have a timestamp on the photograph. Nobody can come and say, hey, there were more kids in the room, or different toys, or anything else. You have a way of storing data and a way of having proof of the data that you're communicating. So what blockchain is doing differently from a database is you can process data in a way that you're able to engage multiple parties in this document sharing or data sharing, and nobody can lie to each other. Because as you're taking these snapshots, you couldn't now suddenly completely change the data. If you're taking the example of financial markets, you have 3 bank accounts on this blockchain, let's say, and these 3 accounts have different values, and then you have transactions, one person sending this person money, and then sending the other person money. You can see how much money was there at the beginning, and how much money is where when, and as you have these snapshots of the data, you don't need to prove to anyone what you have done, because the proof is in the storage. It's very different in a database, because when you have a database, you can go in, you can change the records, and depending on the database model, you can't really show what the data was before you made the change, or whether there were many changes before. So that's quite cool about blockchain. But it really is just a data capture and a data processing system. So it's not this big solution to all world's problems, it's just a technology that we can use. There's been a lot of talk about applying blockchain technology to financial markets. The interesting part there obviously is that it can be decentralized depending on the type of blockchain, where you're then able to have changes to the accounts reflected globally in almost real time, so that people can transact funds over borders in seconds rather than minutes or days. And there were many other applications. We looked at blockchain because the double counting issue I mentioned earlier and the data sharing issue I mentioned earlier can be addressed in a blockchain. In a blockchain, we can do a lot of sexy things. We can store the data and have it available to everybody straight away. We can manipulate the data, and because we have the record, people will never say, hey, I want to sell you a carbon credit that I've already sold to somebody else. Because once it's sold, it's in the blockchain and you can't change that anymore. So that's a very interesting aspect for us. So the traceability and immutability aspect changes carbon markets. Traders and participants can now trust the information they see. But another bigger part of it is the transparency. So we obviously want to do this as a non-profit foundation to direct funding to forest conservation projects. One of the challenges that foundations have in today's world, and that's across the entire charitable or philanthropic spectrum, is that people give money and they don't really know what it's for. You're in some shop and they ask you to pay another £1 to protect some children somewhere in some country, but you don't really know what's happening with that money. By transacting it through a blockchain stack, we're now able to show people exactly where the money is going and what it's doing. I'll come to an example in a little bit. But what we've really done at Poseidon as a company engaging in climate action, and that's really what we are. We are a company that engages in climate action much more than a blockchain company. So what we've done is we've taken a real world problem, which is climate change. We looked at a way to addressing this problem, which is through forest conservation. And we found that using the blockchain technology allowed us to manage carbon credits that funnel the funding to these projects in a transparent and traceable way, in an immutable data storage that creates confidence and trust in a market that currently has these challenges. As we were going through this, and I think that happens to most companies, we realized that there were some beautiful add-on effects we didn't even consider. So what I'm going to tell you now, what we're doing as our main focus, wasn't our idea at the beginning at all. That's just something that came up. So as we put things onto the blockchain, we developed the software, and I'm proud to say we have a working software. We're not one of those blockchain companies that has a nice PowerPoint and hope to raise money on the back of that. We have a working project, we've demonstrated this, and we have actually here in London a pilot that will go live on the 1st of May, where all of you can go and do some shopping and offset your purchases on the spot. And we have demonstrated this pilot and the software, and we're done with the integration. And as we were doing this, we realized that what we can also do with blockchain is we can do microtransactions. We can process fractions of carbon credits, not tons, but now grams, because obviously what blockchain does, because it's distributed and you don't need to spend time proving to other parties what you have done, we're now able to slice tons of carbons into grams of carbon. And using the blockchain technology, we're able to transact these grams of carbon credits in a very fast and very cost-effective way. So nobody with the right mind in today's world would send a buddy on the other side of the planet 10 pence. Because sending 10 pence over a wire transfer will cost you a few dollars, or a few pounds. So why would you do it, right? It's the same reason why nobody transacts tons of carbon. Why everybody is transacting tons of carbons rather than grams of carbon. But using blockchain technology, we can address that, and that's what all these financial startups in the blockchain space are saying. We can do now very fast and very cost-effective transfers, and it's great for the financial world. What it means for us is we could now, and that was a revelation for us and a paradigm shift for the carbon markets, we could now attach carbon markets to the retail sector. Because now, of course, we can transact grams, we can transact them immediately, and we can transact them for virtually no cost. So I'll tell you what that means. That means if you next time when you go into a shop and you buy yourself a pair of leather shoes and you pay, I don't know, 69 pounds or whatever you pay for leather shoes, you can, at the point of purchasing those leather shoes, with our integration, offset the carbon footprint of the life cycle of those shoes or products and services that you're buying. Which is great. That's revolutionary. That's really a paradigm shift, and we're super excited about it. Because what you're able to do is you're really able to attach the solution to the problem. The problem really is lifestyle choices. And that's not a bad thing, right? I mean, I fly planes, I go on holidays, I love doing crazy things, and I know they're having a negative environmental impact. But I would feel much better if I could do all those things and rebalance my impact on the environment at the moment when I'm doing it. And what is really incredibly beautiful about doing it at that moment is that it becomes a very fractional, tiny additional spend. So going back to the shoes, nobody knows how much carbon is really associated with a pair of shoes. Really, like nobody. Apart from people who work on this. But even people who work on this, they have to look it up. And it's very surprising, I tell you that. So when I was asked first what I think the carbon footprint of shoes is, I'm like, I don't know. I mean, grams, kilograms, tons, that doesn't even mean anything to me. But in monetary terms, I would have said a couple of dollars, whatever. And it turns out that the carbon footprint, the carbon credit equivalent that is required, so you buy a carbon credit, you have the funding, you channel it to a forest conservation project that conserves enough trees to absorb the carbon dioxide that your shoe has created, turns out that that's 20 pence. So you pay, let's say, $69 for your pair of shoes. Would you pay another 20 pence to offset the negative impact? Of course you would. Everybody would, right? Or another example, you buy yourself a latte at your favorite coffee store. And it's going to cost you 2 pence extra to offset the negative impact of your coffee. So what we can do now is we can offer individuals, corporates and governments to have small contributions at the point where the negative impact happens, to shift this negative impact, rebalance the impact on nature, and create a positive impact. Super exciting, and we're absolutely loving what we're doing. What makes it really beautiful, and that's probably the most powerful part of what we're doing at Poseidon, is that it's scalable. That is what everybody who works in blockchain will tell you. Says our blockchain solution is scalable indefinitely, and in many cases that's the case. But what I mean by scalable is, even if you have the best government in the world or the best corporate in the world, they're not able to turn around policy changes or internal processes in a matter of days. If you as a company would now say, you know what, we're going to from now on offset all the food that is being eaten here, and we're going to find a way that in all our offices around the world, all the food is now carbon neutral because we're offsetting it. That in itself will require many, many meetings and many discussions and sign-offs and whatever. And that is the problem for all corporates. For governments, it's even worse. Governments, they have to go through all sorts of channels, and you have to put it forward to different bodies that need to sign off and then make analysis and God knows what. And they're all having great intentions at heart, and that everything they're doing is important and they should continue doing it, but it takes a long time. In the retail sector, we can roll it out within a matter of days, and once we've rolled it out with a retail partner who has a global presence, we can move it from this first store where we've done it as a pilot globally, really in a matter of minutes, because it's a software integration that we've done. Once it's there, they deploy it, it's done. So the fact that we can scale it so quickly makes Poseidon very unique. We can get to a stage very rapidly where we can help billions of people around the world do small contributions as they live their life to help us get enough funding to protect the forests that are at stake. And before I let you ask questions, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions, I just wanted to give you a way to understand how urgent it is to address climate change. Because the problem we're having is, I grew up in Germany, and in Germany we had this saying that loosely translated means after me the flood. It's obviously in reference to the Bible, and it basically more or less means I'll do whatever I want to the environment, it's not going to affect me, it's going to be like a few generations after me. Where it turned out that caught up much faster than we thought. So we're now realizing climate change is happening now. But very few realize how bad it is. There was, and I don't want to paint a dark picture, but I just want you to understand where we stand. There's been a report published from the World Wildlife Fund a few days ago, or 2 weeks ago, something like that. And there was a scientific report that was worked on for quite some time. And the outcome from this report is really shocking. They looked at different scenarios. What if we meet the Paris Agreement? So all the governments and corporates do what they should do. Another scenario was, what if we meet the current pledges by different governments? Because that's also, there's a difference between that. Another scenario looked at what if we achieve to stay below 2 degrees? And the final scenario said, what if we just continue doing what we do at the moment, globally? And the scientific analysis showed that if we continue doing globally what we're doing at the moment, then by 2080, and that's not far away, by 2080, about 70% of all the plants in the Amazon will have died. About 75% of all amphibian life in the Amazon will have died, and it will not be isolated to the Amazon. That's just about 60 years away. So it's not like we have a lot of time to do something. So we need to scale quickly, which is why what we're at Poseidon doing is really revolutionary, because we can do that. We can scale it very quickly. We can address climate change in a democratic way. We can get individuals around the world to join hands and to turn the ship around and really address deforestation in a way that we believe can address climate change in the most effective manner.